flows with ease, cause you know that's how I be dropping it. Yo, can't be stopping it. I'm shocking this and that person over there. So let me do some shit that I don't care to do. I'm doing a haiku, counting syllables and shit. I don't know the rules, so I can't start it right now. But what I can do is the essay number 2 of the book, Propaganda, the Formation of Attitudes, Majakas elude the truth. But when you read it from Ellul, then you cannot deny that propaganda has taken over our lives. Bullshit fills our mind. Yeah, that's the time. Finally, we take propaganda in its broadest sense, so that it embraces the following areas. Psychological action. The propagandist seeks to modify opinions by purely psychological means. Most often he pursues a semi-educative objective and addresses himself to his fellow citizens. Okay, semi-educative objective and addresses to the fellow citizens. So this is psychological action. One of the area that propaganda affects. Then psychological warfare. Here the propagandist is dealing with a foreign adversary whose morale he seeks to destroy by psychological means, so that the opponent begins to doubt the validity of his beliefs and actions. So the opponent doubts the validity of his beliefs and actions. So that could be what a lot of conspiracy theory out there could be all about. It could just be a psychological warfare. Because it does tend to affect the morale. This whole rabbit hole does. So obviously there would be psych warfare even in the conspiracy theory areas. But anyway, that was just an example. There's a lot of truth there too. Re-education and brainwashing. Complex methods of transforming an adversary into an ally, which can only be used on prisoners. So that's called re-education and brainwashing. That's what people really think propaganda is, but it's just one of the many different areas. Public and human relations. PR, public relations, came from propaganda actually. It was just a more hygienic sounding name than propaganda, so they started calling it public relations. And then later human relations for the slaves. So these must necessarily be included in propaganda. This statement may shock some readers, but we shall show that these activities are propaganda because they seek to adapt the individual to a society, to a living standard, to an activity. They serve to make him conform, which is the aim of all propaganda. So based on his definition, these standards or these activities are adapting the individual to the group. Therefore, since they're making him conform without his own choice, that is propaganda. So propaganda in its broad sense includes all of these. In the narrow sense, it is characterized by an institutional quality. In propaganda, we find techniques of psychological influence combined with techniques of organization and the envelopment of people with the intention of sparking action. This then will be the broad field of our inquiry. From this complete universe of propaganda, I have deliberately excluded the following subjects found in most propaganda studies: Historical accounts of propaganda, particularly of the recent past, 1914 or 1940 and so forth. Propaganda and public opinion as an entity, considering public opinion, its formation, and so forth, as the major problem, and propaganda as a simple instrument for forming or changing opinion as the minor problem. So this is talking about governmental agencies, I guess. Psychological foundations of propaganda. On what prejudices, drives, motivations, passions, complexes does the propagandist play? What psychic force does he utilize to obtain his results? So that's the psychological foundation of propaganda. So he doesn't really talk about those things, like Freudian concepts. The techniques of propaganda. How does the propagandist... Oh yeah, speaking of this, a great video that, a great movie actually, it's called The Century of Self, and it talks a lot about the psychological foundations of propaganda. It talks about the historical accounts of propaganda, and as an entity. It talks about all of these things actually. It's amazing. So the techniques of propaganda, how does the propagandist put the psychic force into action? How can he reach people? How can he induce them to act? And then lastly, the media of propaganda, the mass media of communication. So if you want to learn about these, go watch The Century of the Self. It's available on YouTube. And that'll teach you all these things, which he doesn't mention. Let me see. He has excluded these subjects. Such are the 5 chapter headings found everywhere. Somewhat less common are studies on the characteristics of the great examples of propaganda, Hitlerite, Stalinist, American, and so on. These are omitted here precisely because they have been frequently analyzed. The reader will find in the bibliography all that is useful to know on each of these questions. I have instead tried to examine aspects of propaganda very rarely treated, to adopt a point of view, a perspective, an unorthodox view. I have sought to use a method that is neither abstract nor statistical, but occasionally relies on existing studies. The reader should know that he is not dealing with an encyclopedia of propaganda, but with a work that assumes his familiarity with its psychological foundations, techniques, and methods, and that